Hello there, it's Tom here, and this is Chapter 16 of Humperdump Crump, A Ghost Story. Now, looking back on it, I feel that this is a pretty solid chapter that basically stands on its own and doesn't require a lot of explanation. Unfortunately, that does mean there isn't much to say about it, but let's take a look anyway. By the time this chapter rolled around, I was already pretty comfortable with drawing the comic, and I wanted to start trying a few things that were a bit more creative. This page, for example, the majority of it is just a silent scene of a fly being caught in a spider's web and then eventually being killed. I could imagine how this scene played out if it were in a movie or an animation of some kind, and I tried to convey that in the comic, but I'm not sure if comics as a medium is best used when trying to emulate other types of media, such as books or movies. Since comics lay pretty much right between prose and animated visuals, I find that they work best when they don't try to lean towards one of the two extremes. A comic that is text-heavy can be just as badly done as a comic that is far too detailed, for example, or trying to convey everything solely with motion. And I was trying to find that balance, and of course I'm still trying to find that balance, and there are people who are exceptions and are really good at doing things with comics that are outside of the norm. But I think in general, I think a good comic does things which you can't do solely through text or through animation. And this chapter was kind of about playing around with different things that I could do with comics. Oh, and what's this? So Annie's just sitting under a tree reading a book when Cat comes and meets her, and Annie is talking to Katrak, apparently the psychopomp of insects, and I wanted to completely avoid any attempt at trying to draw him, because I think it's much better to leave certain things up to the viewer's imagination, but also I didn't want to commit myself to any single design for what an insectoid psychopomp might look like. Not because I'd have to design some weird-looking insect thing, but more because I thought it'd be more interesting to try and imagine what the mind of an insect, or all insects, would perceive as a force or a creature that eventually meets them upon their death. I came to the conclusion that since the mind of an insect is so far removed from the human mind that even the very concept of a being like this would be so far removed from what we could imagine, I think it would be almost a disappointment to try and show in visual form what a creature like this might look like. It's a writer and artist's trick that's been used many, many times before, and this is just my little nod to it. But their conversation is basically an intro into finding out more of Annie's past, when she used to live in the hospital and meet with other psychopomps and afterlife guides. Finally getting back to the story that was first revealed when Mutt made himself visible to Annie down by the Annan waters. And on this page, this panel is an example of me trying to play around with a scene transition that I think works quite nicely. It leads to the introduction not only of the first time we get to see Annie's mum, but also a couple of afterlife guides, who turn out to be Maltanos and the Molly-Doo. Now, I'm probably pronouncing their names completely wrong, so I'll just refer to them as Matilda and Doo, the dog. Doo is actually the inspiration for the Hound of the Baskervilles, and I was originally going to have him quite proud of that fact and always talking about it, but that was something I had to cut for brevity's sake. You might also notice that I'm using the textured backgrounds again, and originally I only used these for flashbacks, but later in the comic I did really like the effect that it made, so I ended up using that all the time in the backgrounds. So Doo and Matilda head off with Annie into the hospital because they need her to help settle a dispute. And here I can point out another pet peeve of mine that I came very close, I think, to doing myself, and that is writing characters that speak in dialect. I rarely see this done very well. And I also come close sometimes with Zimmy's speech and sometimes the other fairies. Now, I think the reason why writing characters speaking in dialect annoys me so much is because I think by and large a writer's own personal accent is seen as the baseline default, and all the quote-unquote normal characters will speak in that way. So when a character with a heavy accent is introduced, I think it's assumed that the reader will also find the dialect strange and exotic. But personally I just find it takes away from the comic in general. I think the text in a comic is there to be spent as little time as possible on, and when you come across words that are phonetically spelled very strangely, I find that really leads to a break in the flow of a story. Technically everybody has an accent, and if you introduce characters that have a different way of speaking to the main crowd, I think that shows a little too much bias on the part of the creator. An American writer, for example, might write British characters with a thick phonetic accent, whereas an English writer might write American characters with a thick phonetic accent. I think unless this is an element of the story that you're trying to convey and is important, for example, in an autobio you might want to convey the feeling of being in a strange area where people talk differently to yourself. I don't really think it serves much of a purpose. I think it's fine to use regional turns of phrase, but I rarely see phonetic spelling of dialect done well. So there you go. Also music. Don't try and write music into your comic. I mean, come on, man. Anyway, yakety yak. Shove Annie in a room, and there's some weird bed in there, and a kid under the bed. And since this is a big strange sequence where Annie is discovering this young boy, I wanted to treat it almost like a dream sequence where the perspective is all warped and changed and skewed. It was just an attempt to show that things aren't quite what they seem and weird stuff is happening. I kind of enjoyed drawing these panels where I show the creature's remains kind of spread over the room. So Annie herself realizes that things aren't quite what they appear, and that what actually happened is that it was fire spreading around the room. Fire which unfortunately envelops the boy, because he's basically stuck in a place where he's just reliving how he died. But because Annie comes to realize that none of this stuff is real, she's able to walk through it and eventually calm the boy down, allowing Matilda and Doo to come into the room. Annie has to make a choice of which one to go with. I decided that he would go with Matilda in the end because he was probably a bit more comfortable going off with a fairly normal-looking older woman than he would be hitting off into the unknown with a pitch-black dog with glowing red eyes. It also allowed me to draw Doo again in these final panels here when he mentions that the world continues to spin, something that will come back again a lot later. And this story leads to Annie and Kat talking about Jeanne, again, the ghost girl, and maybe she's stuck in a similar situation. And it's the start of them really deciding that maybe they should do something to help. And the chapter ends with just a little scene between Annie and her mom. And this bonus page is just to illustrate a few of the interesting black dog myths that I came across when I was doing research. And black dog myths, I think, are pretty interesting, and there seems to be quite a lot of them in Europe. I mentioned in a previous video that this was why I wanted to incorporate these sort of myths into the comic, because you don't tend to hear too much about them. I think it goes without saying that I'm more of a dog person than a cat person, which is no surprise considering the 1967 United Kingdom referendum, which found that cats are dumb and dogs are cool. And that's the end of that chapter. So, top of the morning to you. Let's put a shrimp on the barbie and fetch me my Stetson and shooting irons, and come back again for Chapter 17, The Medium Beginning.